Not a long one, but a weird experience I had while in a field event in New York. It was a week-long field event somewhere near Fort Drum. I'm not really sure where, and I slept on the whole bus ride out there. Anyway, on the second night out, it was really cold, and for some reason my lieutenant decided a rocky hill would be the perfect place for a patrol base. It was my turn on watch, freezing my butt off and very awkwardly wedged on a large boulder. I was scanning the woods with my night vision goggles, which were constantly going in and out because the battery was dying, when I heard the very loud crunch of sticks and leaves, maybe 20 meters out. I turned on the floodlight on my nods, and I could just kinda see this wiry, pale dude, average height, normal posture, no clothes. It was like 15 degrees out, so I was gonna call out to him and ask if he was okay. I started to get on a knee, but he heard me and absolutely bolted in the opposite direction, like light speed through extremely rocky and uneven terrain. I sat there nervous for the duration of my watch. When it was over, I woke up my buddy and went to sleep. I never saw anything like that again for the rest of the event. I worked at a sleepaway camp last summer, and some weird stuff happened to a buddy of mine. Basically, the camp owns a few acres of forest and 2 lakes. And all summer, this mysterious guy was living on the property. Illegally, obviously. The cops knew and had tried to search, but they told us to just contact them if he showed up again, because they couldn't find him. One night, someone found several killed animals near the camp, so my friend Dylan had to search the forest with a partner. The two of them ran down a trail headed towards that location, carrying a hunter's knife and a walkie-talkie. They made it about half a mile into the woods from the main campground when they heard a sudden movement. When they shot their flashlight in that direction, they spotted the deranged man. Naked, hands and face bloodied, with a few dead rabbits in his hands. They stood there for all of 2 seconds, then sprinted back to the camp. Apparently, no one's seen him since. Back in the early 2000s, I was 12 years old and camping with my family in the Adirondacks in New York. Me and my older sister, who was 14 at the time, went hiking up this really steep mountain in the woods for a long time. We got to a clearing at the top when we heard someone say, "Hey kids, up here." We looked up and saw a very pale, thin, bald man in a tight-fitting dark suit sitting way up in a spruce tree, much higher than anyone could get as there were no branches down low. He looked really old and wrinkly, and he was eating this really dark, bloody meat and making these nasty smacking and burping noises. His face was smeared with blood. we were overcome by the most foul odor you can possibly imagine, like awful, rotten things. The pale man was tossing pieces of this nasty, bloody meat down as he ate. He kept commenting on how good it tasted, and asked where he could go to find more. He said he murdered a family just over yonder, and that we could go check if we didn't believe him. My sister burst into tears. We turned and ran for dear life down the mountain. Eventually we turned, expecting to see him chasing us. But he was still up there, just screaming after us and laughing. We got back to camp, and of course my parents didn't believe us, but we did call the cops. They sent one ancient park ranger to come drive up the mountain and check it out. He came back a while later, saying all he found was a gutted deer, probably hunters. Later that night, around the campfire, I saw the man again, in a tree just past our campsite. He was still eating, and I could still hear him chomping and smacking, even though he should have been too far away for me to hear. I started crying, and no one else saw him. I remember the sheer horror I felt seeing that man. Nothing has ever scared me so bad as he did. I remember knowing somehow that no one could save me from him. Not my dad, not my mom, not the police. No one, if he wanted to kill me. Years later, I brought it up to my sister, and she totally freaked out. I have a honey hole about 3 miles deep into the national forest area where I hunt. Usually get dropped off and hike in for a weekend. Hogs, white-tailed deer, black bears, and panthers are all in the area I've grown up around, and there isn't much I haven't seen out there. Last November, I made the trek back in there and set up my hammock and got ready to camp out for the night so I could hunt from sunup to sundown. I laid down, and maybe 10 minutes later, heard the most blood-curdling scream not far off. Bobcats, foxes, and limpkins can all sound like screaming, but this was different. There was something about it that just didn't feel right. I sat up and grabbed my binoculars and started scanning the edge of the swamp. I caught a glimpse of what looked like the shape of a woman, running full speed away from something about 200 yards out. Now, mind you, I'm a good few hours' walk from a paved road. Even the service dirt road is maybe a little over a mile behind me, and she's going in the clear opposite direction. The only thing out there is woods and eventually the river. I put down the binoculars and grabbed my rifle so I could use the scope if she was being chased by a bear or panther. I didn't see a thing. Absolutely nothing. I brushed it off as something my mind made up. The sun was setting, so I decided to get some rest. I went to sleep, clutching my rifle a little tighter than usual. I woke up the next morning and decided to go check the spot where I thought I saw her running, and found small, barefoot footprints in the mud. I packed my stuff up quick, fast, and in a hurry. I haven't been back there since. here we go. My time to shine. This happened only a few weeks ago. I live close to the Angeles National Forest. There are some trails within walking distance from my home that take you up into those mountains. It was a very foggy evening, and having just received some bad news over the phone, I wanted to clear my mind with a night hike. I set off at around 8 p.m., sad boy music in my earbuds and a camelback with water and supplies. I didn't plan to be out too long, but I was definitely going to be out for a while. The hike started off great, and the fog was almost sort of a novelty. Very eerie and calm, in a neat sort of way. The only sounds came from water dripping off the plants along the mountainside. Nobody was around, and it felt like I had the mountains to myself. I was hiking without using my flashlight, as it was like driving. High beams of light cut my visibility from about 20 feet to 10 feet. Shining the light would be like facing a wall of whiteness, and it would kill my night vision. After about an hour, things started getting weird. I was maybe 2.5 miles up the trail, and the only light came from the glow of the city behind me. It was getting darker the farther I got up and into the mountains. I started smelling smells? Synthetic. First it was perfume for a few seconds. Just a whiff. I couldn't see more than 15 feet or so in front of me at that point, so I was kind of like, that's kind of odd. The second smell was that of a campfire, which was also odd as there weren't any campgrounds nearby. I shrugged it off and kept going. I then got a whiff of a plant that brought me back to my childhood, as it reminded me of smelling it during summers when I would play outside with my friends. I wasn't too off-put, but it was indeed a bit strange. A bit later, I noticed a dull flash out of the corner of my eye. It was a light coming from a flashlight, but it was above me on the ridge, maybe 50 to 100 feet up. It looked like a glow in the clouds, sort of like how a plane looks when flying through a cloud. It would get brighter and dimmer based on direction. To my knowledge, though, there weren't any trails there. Super weird. I took my earbuds out and listened. Still silence. The light would turn on, sweep, turn off, then turn on again and shine in a different direction. Like someone looking for something. I assumed they were having the same visibility problems I was. I had stopped completely, and watched as the light would continue to turn on and off and move slowly along the ridge. I kept my earbuds out now, and I was just telling myself it was another hiker. I waited for it to pass above me, and kept on. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard whistling. Sort of like someone calling a dog, but from a distance. I looked back, and while I was unable to orient myself due to the fog, the whistling was coming from the light that I could now see was across the canyon I had been walking along. In terms of distance, it was probably about 1/6 of a mile. Just a faint glow through the fog. I watched it for a minute, then kept moving. After maybe another hour and a half, I stopped for some water. The trail had turned from dirt to this sandy, crunchy soil. It had only gotten darker, and I was around 3,200 feet in elevation, so the city lights were not as bright anymore. I noted that my footsteps were the loudest thing out here, which was a bit unsettling. The trail twists and turns along the mountainsides, and there would be these scenic viewpoints at the turns that would give you maybe 50 feet or so to go off trail and look over the edge into the valley. I was about 4.5 miles out at this point. I was keeping track with my watch, so I went out to the edge of the closest view to assess if I wanted to keep going or not. I felt great, energy and fatigue-wise, and although my cell service had been spotty, I was trying to look at sat maps to see what was ahead of me and maybe pick a turnaround point. I'm at the edge of the view, and someone had made a little rock sculpture thing with a weird stick. I took a picture of it. I was just chilling out there for maybe 2 minutes or so looking at the sculpture. I can't see the trail because of the fog and darkness, but I know where it is based on direction. Here's where it gets absolutely terrifying. I pull out my phone to check my texts one last time before setting off, and as soon as I look down at my phone, I hear 5 very fast footsteps from the direction of the trail. And this was the sound that my feet had made because of the soil, and I recognized it immediately. I instantly looked in that direction, and they stopped. Completely. Silence. I scrambled to get my flashlight and knife out of my bag versus using my phone light and fists, and shined in that direction. A wall of fog and silence. The footsteps were not a gallop or the skittering of an animal. It was the footsteps of something walking on 2 legs that stopped on a dime. I could feel the terror rising in my chest as I stood there frozen. I was alone, in the dark, up in the mountains, and something was up here with me. I'm getting goosebumps typing this. Yeesh. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes with the light facing that direction. The biggest problem was that they came from the direction of the trail that I needed to go get back. I thought, screw this. I'm heading back. I slowly approached the trail and walked through where the sound came from, and began to head back down. For maybe the next 20 minutes, every 2 minutes or so I would quickly stop and shine the light behind me. I could have sworn maybe 2 or 3 times I heard an extra step in the distance behind me, like something was matching my footfalls to remain undetected. I was fast walking now, as the visibility was still too poor to run, and I was worried I'd twist an ankle. I kept my light on the whole time, and had my knife out in the other hand. After maybe 30 or so minutes, I heard something crash through the brush on my right, which was the steep side of a canyon. Again, I cannot see anything because of the fog. I moved to the other side of the trail and kept going. Let me tell you, that was the most determined I've been to make it down a trail. I heard other weird sounds along the way, but I ignored them and kept moving. I will never forget that night. I night hiked one more time on the same trail, but it was clear and I had a headlamp on the whole time, and a much bigger knife at my side. That time, I also ran back down when I reached my turnaround point. My wife and I were on a search mission for some missing fern pickers. We were volunteers with the local search and rescue team. We decided to stay in the search area that night and had built a pretty nice fire. We were sitting there, and it was about 0200, hoping this dude would wander into camp. I had heard animals around us throughout the night. No surprise, we're in the middle of the woods, and I'm used to animals stalking around outside my camp. I knew there were 2 animals, one on each side of us. It was at about that point when we heard a bird chirp. It came from about the place I figured one of the animals were. Then another, from the opposite side. I immediately realized we were being watched and stalked by at least 2 cougars. We very quickly climbed into the back of my truck. It's got a camper shell and is outfitted for truck camping. So, about 5 years ago, a friend and I were hiking in the Oregon Cascades in mid-spring. We were about 6 miles from the road, nowhere near a trail on about 6 feet of snow. We were going out for 5 days to attempt to summit a few peaks, so we looked like grizzly mountain men. Around a tree comes 2 guys and a dog, mid-50s, his son mid-20s, and Fifi. They're wearing trail running shorts, running shoes, and a running water backpack, aka nothing of real use. "PCT open?" they asked. My friend and I looked at each other, looked at them, trying not to laugh, and explained. "We're 5 miles from the PCT, and 2,000 feet lower in elevation. What are you trying to do?" They planned on doing a 20-mile run along the PCT starting on the other side of the mountains, but got sidetracked due to snow. Again, we explained that they were screwed. I tell them that there's a road with cell service 6 miles downhill along our tracks, and if need be, we can hike them out. They refused, and asked if the PCT was open again. I flat out told them, "You are screwed, let me hike you out." They were like, "Nah, we've got this," and ran off in the wrong direction. We camped there for the night, and the next morning we followed their tracks for a half-mile. After that, they disappeared. No signs of them. After a few stormy days and failed summit attempts, we hiked out. I drove around to the parking area they mentioned and looked through the wilderness permit tags to try to find a name. Nothing. It gets weird though. A few years later, my parents ran into the same nondescript people in the same area, again asking about a trail loop. Same conditions too. Late winter, snowshoeing far from a road, and they were lost. My dad tried to hike them out, but they denied and took off in the wrong direction. He too followed their tracks for a half-mile before he lost them. So if anyone sees the ghosts of the Oregon Cascades, let me know. When I was younger, my family used to go camping every spring. Now, there wasn't much wilderness to speak of. The wildest thing I saw was a whole bunch of hares that leapt away when I tried to take a picture. So my parents would just let me and my brothers wander around wherever. One morning at sunrise, I woke up. Everyone else was still sleeping, which means I had to stay quiet. But I got bored and decided to go on an early morning stroll. When I got back, the rest of my family was having breakfast in front of the tent, and they looked at me very confused. I asked what the problem was. Turns out, everyone thought I was still in the tent until I came casually strolling up to them from the other side of the campsite. My parents said they had called me for breakfast, but that I had mumbled something and didn't come. My younger brother claimed that he heard me turning in my bed just a few minutes ago. I went into the tent to investigate, and there was no one in my part of the tent. All my stuff appeared to be untouched. We shrugged it off, as obviously there had been some sort of mistake or a collective brain fart. However, when I needed to be somewhere that evening, I went and grabbed my flashlight, and it didn't work. I opened it up to see what the problem was, and the batteries were missing. I checked my parents' flashlights too. No batteries. I checked my brother's. No batteries. We were quite spooked, and for the rest of that stay, I never strayed far from the tent. I used to camp pretty often at a wilderness spot that was a flat ridge on top of a big, steep hill. One section had a trail that was steep but manageable, but the rest of this hill is almost vertical and would be impossible to climb without ropes and a bunch of climbing gear. Even though the top was flat, it was a heavily wooded area. Thick pine trees, lots of underbrush, great views of the area, and far enough off the road that we never saw other people. This particular trip, my girlfriend and best friend came along, so 3 of us spread out in 2 tents. Sometime in the middle of the night, a storm blew through and dropped about an inch of snow on our tents. It was a calm night, without any wind, and real peaceful, all zipped up in our sleeping bags. When we woke up at first light, there was a distinct trail of human footprints in the snow that went all the way across the ridge, through our camp, and about 2 feet from our tents. The crazy thing was, the footprints started from an area that would be impossible to climb up, and ended at another area that would be impossible to climb down, let alone in the dark with snow making the rocks slippery. We measured the footprints, and they were smaller than my friend and I's boots, too big to be my girlfriend's. We could never figure out how someone climbed up that section in the middle of the night, moved through the thick forest without making a sound, and came so close to our tents without anyone knowing. Creepy enough that we packed up pretty fast and got out of there. Two summers ago, in western Norway, I was on summer holiday at my parents' house. I decided to take the dog for an evening walk. We have an old cabin in a mountain valley. It used to be summer pastures for livestock back in the day. I walked up to the cabin. It was overcast, but nice and warm, and the birds were chirping away. I got up to the cabin and sat there while the dog was running around. Suddenly, this wall of fog came down the valley. It was thick and moving incredibly fast. It was one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in my life. The dog suddenly started acting weird and agitated, so I called her back and put her on her leash. I have to admit, I was a bit spooked myself. I started walking back in this thick, terrible fog. I could only see about a meter in front of me, but I knew the road well, so it was impossible to get lost, really. Suddenly, I realized there were no sounds any longer. No birds, no insects, nothing. The dog was acting even weirder, tail down firmly tucked between her legs, and pulling the leash hard like she really wanted to get out of there. Suddenly, I got this deep, primal sense of dread, like my life was in danger. I heard this howl, but not quite. It just sounded wrong. There are no wolves in this part of the country. Both me and my dog freaked out, and we started sprinting like our lives depended on it. While we were running, I heard this weird howl a few more times, and it sounded like it was getting closer. The valley is pretty inclined and steep. It ends in a bend and then opens up a bit. We got there, and finally got out of that fog. As we did, I heard one more sound from further up the valley, and it sounded like a hyena laugh. There are definitely no hyenas in western Norway. I walked for 5 minutes and ran into some old coot on the road that lives in a farmhouse in that area. He asked me if I came from the mountain valley. I said, yes. Do you hear anything? I told him about the howls. Don't go up there when it's foggy, lad. It's not safe. When we were kids, my friend and I were exploring the woods. We got lost and wandered for what felt like an eternity. My friend remained calm, but I was starting to think I was going to die in those woods. Finally, a sense of relief as we stumbled upon this cabin-looking house. We could see a man and woman in front. The woman was on the porch in a rocking chair knitting, while the man was in front of her chopping wood on a stump. I was so overjoyed to see an adult, I quickly approached. The man lowered his axe, and holding back tears, I explained that my friend and I were lost. The man smiled. The woman, who was still sitting in the rocking chair watching, began to laugh. Still struggling not to burst into tears, I looked back at my friend. While I was walking towards the house, my friend had, unbeknownst to me, stayed back near the tree line. I looked at the man and began to repeat our predicament, and he let out a deafening howl of laughter. This only caused the woman's laughter to grow louder as well. I began to slowly walk backwards towards my friend, and eventually turned and sprinted back into the woods. My friend followed suit, and we ran through back deeper into the forest. We ran for as long as we could, but eventually had to slow down to avoid hurting ourselves on fallen branches. Eventually, we made it to a recognizable landmark, and were able to get back to where we entered the woods. I can still hear the laughter of those two in my head to this day. In 2006, I was camping in Pennsylvania with the Boy Scouts. One kid brought some airsoft guns, and we headed into the woods to play. Apparently, the site is next to an older camp that's been abandoned, and we decided that it would be a better map to play there. The game went on for a while, and it started getting dark. I turned a corner just in time to see one kid go into one of the cabins. I decided I was going to go get that camping noob. I went inside the cabin, and it was dark, but I could still see decently well. The walls were rotting, and they looked like they probably weren't of great quality to begin with. There were plenty of cracks to let what was left of the sunlight in. It was a long room with a concrete floor and an open door to a small room at the back. I realized he must be in there. I slowly crept up and readied my pistol. As I walked across the room, there was a growing sense of unease. I realized I couldn't hear anyone else. No shots, no talking, nothing. Instead of backing out, I kept heading for the back room. I figured I'd feel better once I caught up with my enemy. I readied up and jumped into the tiny back room. No one. The room was very small. There was nowhere to hide and no way to exit. Just tiny holes in the tiled walls where sinks would have been mounted, and the door itself as the only light sources. I turned and sprinted out of the cabin. There was no one else in the camp now, but I could hear voices shouting in the woods. I ran through the woods in the direction of the voices until I found some of the scouts. Among them, the kid I thought I had followed into the cabin, who were in the process of capturing one of my teammates. The kid I was looking for told me that we'd been called back to camp. When I asked him, he said he hadn't gone into that cabin. While hiking or exploring, before entering a wooded thicket or possibly inhabited structure, I try to remember to make my presence known to any other living creatures that may be around. I don't want any surprises. Once, I approached an isolated, long-abandoned, decaying house in the forest. I knocked 3 times on the nearest wall and shouted, "Hello? Anybody home?" into the still, quiet interior. To my surprise, after a pause, I heard an echo of 3 knocks on the floor or ceiling above me. I climbed up the stairs to greet the inhabitant, preparing for the worst, but never found anyone or anything else anywhere in the house. This has happened to me on one other occasion, and while I don't attribute it to supernatural or paranormal stuff, I still can't explain it.